but our speaker is based in Singapore, but he's actually in Nepal at the moment.
但是我觉得在这里我要特别去赞叹的是，他们之间的一个祝福，还有赞叹。就是你看，在这个地方呢，我们人医会也是不断的去做推述，然后这个推述，如果这2天你有跟上人的话，上人一直赞叹新马这个部分，然后我们在这里就是他们跟上人视讯，然后彼此赞叹。
Recently, we've been talking a lot about the importance of promoting plant-based diets, and one of the regions in the world that's doing a really good job of this is the Singapore and Malaysia region, which Dharma Master Zheng Yan has acknowledged and recognized. So our speaker today is Brother Ruushi. He is actually in Nepal today, as we mentioned earlier. But he is actually the CEO of the Singapore chapter of Tzu. So this is a video celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Singapore chapter of Tzu.
工们唯有在线上团圆，虽然在不同的地点，但这1小时半的周年庆节目是全道社区志工共同来成就的。
虽然在疫情下有失去了一起手牵着手一起去做活动的那个温度，可是还是。
This volunteer shares that despite in the pandemic, we not having the ability for all the volunteers to come together in person, our hearts are all still together. And amongst other things, one thing we will always continue doing is to continue promoting the importance of plant-based diets.
感动呢，就是其实新加坡无论是对内的邻居、对外的一个接引，都是让人家很感动。尤其他接引到非常多的年轻人，我们熟悉的，现在在我们金色里面的清修寺静恩师姐，常常跟我们分享印度还有国际很多的随师的这位静恩师姐，就是在
So the Malaysian and Singapore branches of Tzu really are exceptional in many different ways. Amongst other things, they have brought in a lot of young volunteers. For example, one of the volunteers at the abode, who has become I forget the specific term, but someone who has dedicated themselves to the missions of Tzu and to advance the missions of Tzu. One of those volunteers that we often hear from, they actually are from Singapore and Malaysia as well, or that region.
所以这个部分就是他们一步一步的。
这个家，我们是展开双手，怀抱大家，是我们大家心灵的故乡。
今年周年庆的主题是有您有我，有爱有家。这个以法汇聚的慈济大家庭，大家携手为苦难付出的同时，也是彼此。
And actually, if I remember correctly, I think the term I was trying to recall was pure practitioner. For those volunteers who have dedicated themselves to the missions of Tzu. So the topic for today's sharing is actually going to be the Singapore volunteers and how they have been dedicated to listening to Dharma Master Zheng Yan's morning Dharma study for many, many years, continuously now.
而我们的刘瑞士执行长、新加坡执行长现在就在尼泊尔，所以我们现在要一起透过通关密语到达尼泊尔。
So let us go visit our speaker in Nepal, who is actually the CEO or the executive director of the Singapore chapter of Tzu. So let's welcome Brother Ruushi.
亲爱的上人、金舍师父，还有
Dharma Master Zheng Yan, Dharma Masters at the Abode, and everybody listening to today's book study. Good day to everyone. So today I'd like to share with everyone about the Singapore chapter's commitment to the morning Dharma study. So in 2013, under Master's guidance, Singapore had a sutra adaptation of the Water Repentance Sutra, as you can see in the photo right here. And so when we were reporting about this to Dharma Master Zheng Yan, she asked us to begin attending morning Dharma studies when we returned. And around that time, Master Zheng Yan was also sharing about the metaphor of the burning house that represents the or a metaphor in the Lotus Sutra of the burning house that represents the three realms. And in that same metaphor, they refer to a goat cart, a deer cart, and a great white ox cart. And when we came back to Singapore, we decided to bring that metaphor of the great white ox cart into reality by purchasing a large white van for Tzu Chi that could carry, I think, up to 8 people to help transport volunteers in the morning to morning Dharma study from their homes to different meeting locations. So for me personally, I knew this was a very important responsibility, transporting these volunteers. And so I would always have 2 alarms instead of just 1. And beginning from 4 a.m. Singapore time, we would start going from location to location to pick up volunteers and bring them to morning Dharma study. At the time, around that time, there was an opportunity to share at a global executive meeting for Tzu Chi. And we talked about at that time how there were 8 different difficulties to attending morning Dharma study. For example, adjusting our own habits, leaving our bed and our blankets, being too far from the meeting location, not having transportation, being hard to focus, not understanding what's being said, having tough bad internet connection, and especially continuing on this path diligently without stopping along the way. These are all difficulties that many volunteers face. And then 3 years later, we once again went back to this executive meeting, and this time we shared about the 8 benefits, the 8 positives of attending morning Dharma study. So amongst them, we can have better mood, we become more eloquent, we have better connections with other people, we have better thoughts, our health improves, our family relationships improve, our life overall improves, and one other that I missed before the slide changed. So the way that many of these morning Dharma studies were organized, we organized partially regionally, just based on where you're geographically located. And then we further separate by, for example, different missions and activities that volunteers are associated with, etc. And so there were multiple different locations that folks would meet up for Dharma study. And on average, it looks like every day we had 200 to 300 people listening. And this was every single day. And even when there were not morning Dharma studies, we would listen to the Tzu Chi program, Essence of the Bodhi Mind. And so there was never a break. There was never any sort of stop in this continuation of daily listening to the Dharma. Now, when the pandemic hit, we weren't able to meet in person anymore. And so we actually started having online Zoom meetings to attend Dharma studies.
线上心法我们想如果只是这样的心法完了之后我们的这个整个就是那个吸收能力还是没有这么好，所以我们就想到一个
So at first we were thinking
我们就是心法之后
At first, we were thinking transitioning to this online method, it might be harder to draw people in. So we started thinking of different ways we could structure these sharings every day. And so we decided that every day for these sharings, we would have someone who would act as, we'll call them a class president. And they would take that day's morning Dharma study, summarize it into the key points and share to everyone afterwards so we can all deepen our understanding. And then beyond that, we then split everyone into little groups of 4 to 5 volunteers each, these little Zoom private rooms, and have folks have the opportunity to share in a more intimate setting. And each of these groups would also have a group leader to help facilitate the conversation. And in this way, volunteers also had the opportunity to bring in what they're learning from the Dharma into different things that were happening in their daily lives, and in that way make a sort of connection.
来解决掉他们的这些种种的一些习气和问题啦。那在这个线上心法这样就是我们因为有这个分享的管理，许多师兄师姐
Now, because there was this element of sharing in these online Dharma studies, there were, of course, some volunteers who perhaps were not as comfortable with sharing or sharing publicly to everyone. And so to make sure we could address everyone's individual preferences, we asked folks, for example, in the Zoom meeting, at the end of their name, to add a little icon, a circular icon like the one you see on the screen, to indicate that, hey, I am not interested in sharing, or I would prefer not to share. But we did see over time that some of these volunteers gradually were more willing to share. And so now we're actually seeing even these online Dharma studies have many hundreds of volunteers joining all together. And it's because of these morning Dharma studies that we can really connect ourselves to the Dharma lineage and continue to learn and improve upon our own wisdom. And at the same time, this is a very good method to invite more folks into the Tzu family, what we call recruiting bodhisattvas. Beyond this, we also have more or less book clubs or book studies for the Lotus Sutra, also based on the guidance of Master. And at this point in Singapore, we have 138 different locations that folks meet up for different book clubs. So a very expensive event as well. So as the volunteers in Singapore will continue to bring the Dharma into our heart and deepen our faith along this path. Thank you, everyone. And so let's actually also take a look at this video. This is a volunteer that says he does repair work, volunteer in Singapore. And so he rents a place, and he actually has a roommate. And sometimes if the roommate, for example, is at home, not working, or just in general because of the timing of the day, how early these morning Dharma studies are, you can see that he just leaves his, I'll call it an apartment, and comes down outside and takes out his iPad to listen to the morning Dharma study. And he's saying, unless you yourself are not willing to be committed, in order to make sure that you are able to attend these morning Dharma studies, you really have to find a method and overcome your difficulties. So morning Dharma studies, this volunteer saying, this morning Dharma studies are an opportunity to connect with Master's teachings. And so, for example, in the morning, about 4:30 a.m., we have these bodhisattva vehicles picking up volunteers all around and bringing them to the central locations to listen to morning Dharma study together. So it depends on, for example, where we live. We'll meet at these different locations. After the pandemic hit, we weren't able to go to these Tzu locations to meet, so everybody would connect online from home. And every day we saw that the number of people listening in would continue to increase because listening online is such a convenient way to connect. And then afterwards, we had these little groups of 4 to 5 people, and we would use about 20 minutes of time to share about what we heard in today's morning Dharma study. So it's something that we really could bring into our own lives. And you'll see this volunteer here, who was what we called the class president earlier. So after every day's morning Dharma study, we had this sharing platform on Zoom. We have this class president who makes us do a summary of today's teaching to, again, deepen our understanding of what was shared today. And this volunteer is sharing that usually as class president, I'll take a pre-look at the content for that day's session, and then I take out, I try to analyze what the key points and the essence of that day's morning Dharma study was, which actually deepens my own understanding, and hopefully does the same for other volunteers as well. And if I'm not able to communicate these key points, then I'm wasting everyone's time in this time of sharing. This other volunteer shares that we have the opportunities in these sharings to talk about problems in our own lives, things that we're facing. And then in our little groups, there's always a group leader who facilitates a conversation, and we all encourage each other. And sometimes even non-certified volunteers, just community volunteers, would join us. Okay, so thank you so much. Let's go back to our CEO of Singapore. Thank you so much once again. This is the CEO of Singapore, Brother Ruushi, who currently is in Nepal. So what time is it in Nepal right now? Right now in Nepal, it's 7 a.m.
早上的7点哈，所以我们非常感恩这样，是我们非常感恩这样的一个科技。
Yes, so we're very grateful for this connection that we can make through technology.
早上熏法香的时候，每次遇到初一十五的时候呢，就是有另外一个拜金的一个安排。那多数的人可能就另外选择，像我就没有那么精进，我就没有来进士堂熏法香。那个时候都是要来进士堂，不是说像在家里的。可是我刚才才知道。
So on the lunar calendar, every month, the 1st and the 15th, typically there is not a morning Dharma study session. And so we mentioned earlier, even on these days in Singapore, they continue to listen to Dharma, but in a different form, through programs or a Tzu program, TV program called Essence of the Bodhi Mind. And Sister Meiyun is sharing that she herself is not so diligent on the 1st and the 15th. Sometimes she may not, find some alternate methods, but it was very touching to hear about how the Singapore volunteers continue to be diligent every single day.
新加坡熏法香，也就是因为这样子的一个因缘，即便呢走过了28年的新加坡，依然让人家感觉到法入心，法入心。And
seeing the diligence of the Singapore volunteers, we really can see why even after 28 years of Singapore or the Tzu chapter in Singapore, the volunteers are still so connected to the Dharma of Tzu.
非常感动哈。那这边我回应一下哈，这里